Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're venturing into a text that's, well, a foundational for so much of Western thought and ethics, the Book of Genesis.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's the first book of the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament.
hmm
It really sets the stage.
It does, and it's not just ancient history. It tackles these huge questions about, creation, humanity, our relationship with the divine, how we should interact.
Exactly. The bedrock principles, really.
Right. And look, we're going beyond the sort of simple Sunday school versions today. We've got this analysis, 100 ethical and moral problems in Genesis, and it really peels back the layers on some incredibly complex stuff.
Mm-hmm. Gets into the weeds, the really challenging ethical questions these stories throw up, often quite unsettling ones.
Totally. So our mission here is basically to unpack some of the biggest, most debated ethical issues in Genesis, using this analysis as our guide. Think of it as a shortcut to getting your head around these complexities.
And hopefully uncover some surprising insights along the way, things that might make you see these familiar stories a bit differently.
Okay, so where do we start? Got to be the beginning, right? The primordial history, Genesis 1 to 11, creation, the garden, all that.
Makes sense? Let's dive right into the Garden of Eden, Genesis 1 to 3. One of the first ethical tensions that jumps out is God's command. Don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Right. And the immediate question is, well, was that ethical? To forbid knowledge, to essentially limit their potential for understanding morality.
It sets up this fundamental clash, doesn't it? Divine command versus maybe human autonomy or curiosity. Were they meant to stay? Innocent but ignorant.
And then you throw the serpent into the mix.
Temptation.
Yeah.
And our source points out, how does this tempter fit into a creation that was just declared good?
Good point.
So did God allow the tempter? What does that mean for free will, for responsibility? Were Adam and Eve truly free agents here?
It really complicates the idea of a perfect start, you know? The serpent's presence feels like a built-in problem.
A paradox right from the get-go. And the consequences? Wow, the curses. Pain in childbirth, toiling for food.
Collective punishment, basically.
Exactly. The analysis highlights this as setting a precedent for punishing the many for the actions of a few, which forces us to ask, is that just? Especially for future generations.
It feels really harsh. Especially when you think about it, they didn't know good and evil before they ate the fruit, so how culpable were they, really?
That's a huge point. And then there's a specific curse on Eve. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you.
Oof. Yeah. That line has done a lot of heavy lifting historically to justify patriarchy.
It has. And the source flat out asks, is this ethically defensible? Especially from a modern perspective, but maybe even questioning the divine source of that hierarchy.
And the punishment itself, getting kicked out of Eden
Yeah.
forever for one act of disobedience, arguably driven by wanting to understand more.
It seems disproportionate, doesn't it, given their initial, well, lack of moral knowledge.
Yeah. And the idea that knowledge itself, knowledge of good and evil, is presented as the forbidden thing, the sin, doesn't that kind of devalue curiosity, moral growth? Like, ignorance is bliss.
It's a strange message if you read it that way. And then there's the blame game. Adam blames Eve.
The woman you gave me.
Right. And Eve blames the serpent. Nobody really takes full responsibility.
Classic pass the buck. So, okay, here's a mind bender the source raises. God's omniscience. If God knew they were going to eat the fruit, were their actions really free, or was it all sort of pre-scripted?
That's the age-old free will versus determinism debate right there in Genesis 3. It's a massive philosophical question.
It is. And mortality as a punishment, too. Death enters the picture. What does that say about the value of life itself if it ends as a penalty? Does it imply life without God's approval is somehow less valuable?
Deep questions about divine justice, the nature of life. It's all packed in there.
Okay, let's move on. Genesis 4, Cain and Abel. The first murder. But the ethical issues start even before that, right?
Absolutely. With God's response to their offerings. He accepts Abel's, rejects Cain's.
Why? The text isn't super clear.
It's not explicit. Interpretations vary. Maybe Abel's was seen as better quality or offered with a better heart, but the text itself just states the preference, which looks like divine favoritism.
And pretty arbitrary favoritism at that. It understandably makes Cain angry, jealous.
Setting the stage for tragedy. So the source asks, is that kind of divine conduct fair? Seemingly playing favorites without clear rules.
It definitely feels problematic. And then God warns Cain. Says sin is crouching at the door, but
he doesn't physically stop the murder? Which brings up that balance again. Divine awareness versus human responsibility. How much should God intervene? Could Cain have resisted?
The text seems to imply he could have. You must rule over it.
Right. Suggesting the choice and the responsibility was ultimately Cain's, and the murder itself, fratricide, brother killing brother, shows how quickly things escalate from disobedience to violence.
A chilling escalation. And Cain's punishment, being a wanderer but with a protective mark.
Yeah, it's complex. He's punished, exiled, stigmatized, but also protected by God from being killed himself. Is that justice? Is it effective?
Our source points out the lack of, restorative justice. No healing, no reconciliation, just exile and a mark.
And that mark, it's both protection and stigma, isn't it? A constant, visible reminder of his sin.
Also interesting, God keeps talking to Cain, even after the murder.
It suggests God doesn't just abandon sinners, which is, well, a nuanced aspect of the divine character here.
And a quick side note, the source mentions the whole, where did Cain get his wife thing, if you take it literally.
It implies incest among the earliest humans, which is ethically complicated for many readers.
Yeah. And then later, Cain's descendant Lamech brags about taking wildly disproportionate vengeance.
77-fold. It shows this downward spiral of violence and personal justice getting way out of hand.
Okay, shifting gears to a story of massive scale. Noah and the flood, Genesis 6-9. This one is ethically loaded.
Hugely. The core issue. Wiping out almost all life on Earth because of human wickedness. It's the ultimate collective punishment.
And the source doesn't pull punches. It asks, is it ethical to kill innocent animals? And crucially, innocent children in this giant flood?
It's a profoundly difficult question. The scale of the destruction is almost unimaginable, and attributing it to a divine act raises enormous ethical problems.
And Noah, he's called righteous. But what did that mean then? By what standard? The text is quite brief on the details.
It is. And the whole selection process, saving just Noah's family and certain animals, condemning everyone and everything else, that raises serious questions about divine judgment, fairness, who gets saved and why.
You also never hear about the psychological impact on the survivors. Imagine being the only people left after seeing the entire world destroyed.
Right. The trauma must have been immense, but the narrative just moves on. And then there's that line in Genesis 6.6 where God regretted making humans.
Yeah, that's a strange one. Regret implies, what? Imperfect foresight, divine emotions that change. It challenges ideas of God's perfection and omniscience.
It definitely anthropomorphizes God in a way that raises theological questions. And then, right after the flood, the command is be fruitful and multiply.
Which feels a bit jarring, doesn't it? After just wiping almost everyone out. What's the message there about the value of the life that was just lost versus repopulation?
It's an abrupt transition. Then we get Noah's curse on Canaan, his grandson.
Because Ham, Canaan's father, saw Noah drunk and naked and didn't cover him up properly.
Exactly. But Noah curses Canaan, which seems disproportionate and misdirected. Why punish the grandson for the father's actions?
And historically, that passage was terribly misused, wasn't it?
Horrifically. Twisted to justify slavery, particularly of people of African descent, by falsely associating them with Canaan's curse. A stark warning about interpreting these texts.
Absolutely. The incident itself, Noah's drunkenness, also raises questions about, parental flaws and how children should respond, filial piety versus reality.
It's complex. And even the detail about saving 7 pairs of clean animals versus just 1 pair of unclean ones. What are the criteria? What does that imply about valuing different forms of life?
And finally, the Rainbow Covenant. God promises never to flood the whole earth again.
Which is presented as mercy, but it also implies the flood was a tool God considered and used. It doesn't rule out other forms of mass destruction, just that specific method.
Right. It confirms the flood was a deliberate choice, which brings us back to the ethics of that choice. Okay, last stop in this early section. The Tower of Babel, Genesis 11.
Here the issue is God stepping in to stop humanity from building a tower reaching to the heavens. They were united, speaking one language.
And God seems threatened, worried about their ambition. Nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them.
That's the implication.
Yeah.
So God confuses their language, scatters them across the earth. The source asks, is it ethical to deliberately suppress human unity and progress like that?
Was unity really a bad thing, or was it just human potential that seemed problematic to the divine?
It raises questions about whether the narrative portrays a God who fears unchecked human capability.
And making linguistic diversity something we often value today seem like a punishment. That feels off.
It does frame cultural and linguistic difference as a negative consequence, which is an interesting perspective given how we often view diversity now.
And unlike with Adam or Cain, there's no warning dialogue here, is there? God just sort of acts.
Seems more unilateral, yes. A different kind of divine interaction than we saw earlier.
Okay, so that covers the primordial history. Now, Genesis shifts focus, moving into the patriarchal narratives, stories about individuals and families, starting with Abraham.
Right. Genesis 12 onwards. And Abraham's story starts with a big ask. God tells him to leave everything home, family, for a land he doesn't know.
That's a huge ethical demand in itself, isn't it? Asking for that level of blind trust and sacrifice.
It is. It sets the stage for a life defined by faith, but also by immense uncertainty and personal cost.
And pretty quickly, we see Abraham doing something ethically dubious, passing off his wife, Sarah, as his sister, twice.
To save his own skin in foreign lands. Yeah. Our source definitely flags this. Is self-preservation a justification for putting Sarah at risk?
Seems pretty questionable. He's endangering her to protect himself.
It establishes a bit of a pattern. We should also briefly note the covenant God makes with Abraham.
Yeah.
It's exclusive. This raises questions about the status of other nations, those outside the chosen line.
True. And then the whole situation with Sarah, Hagar, and Ishmael, that's really tough.
It's incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
Sarah treats Hagar harshly, and Abraham basically lets her. Hagar even runs away once.
And then later, Sarah demands Hagar and her son Ishmael be expelled, cast out into the wilderness.
And Abraham, after some prompting from God who says he'll look after Ishmael, goes along with it. It looks like a clear abuse of power, cruelty, abandoning a woman and child.
And God sanctions it. That's what makes it so challenging ethically. The source really emphasizes questioning that divine approval of what seems like such a harsh act.
How do you square that with a God who is supposed to be just and compassionate? It's a major point of tension.
And then, the big one, the Akita, the binding of Isaac. God tells Abraham to sacrifice his own son.
Arguably the single most ethically fraught moment in Genesis. It pushes questions about faith, obedience, and morality to the absolute limit. What does it mean to trust a God who asks for something so horrific?
It's staggering. And Abraham's willingness, he seems ready to go through with it without the kind of bargaining he later does for Sodom.
Yeah.
Why no protest here?
That silence, that apparent compliance, is deeply disturbing to many. What kind of faith requires that?
And what about Isaac? The psychological trauma for the child, being led up a mountain by your father to be sacrificed? The text doesn't really explore his perspective.
It doesn't. It's focused on Abraham's test.
Yeah.
And even Abraham's words to Isaac. God will provide the lamb, while true in the end, are deceptive in the moment. He's hiding the awful reality.
Okay, let's touch on Sodom and Gomorrah again. Another collective punishment story.
Yes, total destruction. Even if the cities were sinful, the question remains. What about any potentially innocent people swept up at it? Children again.
But here, Abraham does argue with God. He bargains. What if there are 50 righteous people? 40? 30?
That negotiation is fascinating. It shows a human pushing back, advocating for justice, appealing to God's own character. It suggests maybe divine decisions aren't always set in stone, or at least that human advocacy matters.
It's a powerful moment. Okay, let's move to the final major figure we're focusing on. Joseph. Genesis 37 to 50, a long, complex story.
And it starts with family dysfunction right away. Jacob's blatant favoritism towards Joseph, the coat of many colors.
Which, predictably, makes his brothers incredibly jealous. So, parental favoritism, ethical problem number one.
Definitely. And Joseph doesn't help things by sharing his dreams about ruling over them.
Was he just being naive? Or kind of arrogant? Either way, it fueled the fire.
It absolutely did, leading to the brothers' plot to kill him. Reuben steps in so they don't kill him, but
They sell him into slavery instead, which is still a monstrous betrayal, selling your own brother.
a profound act of cruelty. And then they deceive their father, Jacob, making him think Joseph's dead for years.
The amount of grief they inflict on Jacob is just awful. A terrible, prolonged deception.
And Joseph faces his own trials in Egypt, unjustly accused by Potiphar's wife, thrown in prison.
Right. He suffers immensely for something he didn't do.
And then gets forgotten in prison for 2 years by the cupbearer he helped, just overlooked. Shows how easily injustice can be compounded by neglect.
So eventually, Joseph rises to power, interprets Pharaoh's dreams, comes up with this plan to save Egypt from famine.
Which works. It saves lives. But the source points out, the way it works involves consolidating massive power for Pharaoh. People end up selling their land, even themselves, into servitude to survive.
So was the policy ultimately ethical? Good intentions saved lives, but the long-term result was widespread servitude. It's complicated.
Very. Good ends, but potentially questionable means or consequences. And then we get to Joseph interacting with his brothers again when they come to Egypt for food.
Yeah, he does not make it easy for them. This is where it gets really interesting ethically.
He pretends not to know them, accuses them of being spies, throws Simeon in jail. He puts them through the ringer.
Was it justified? Was it a necessary test to see if they'd changed? Or was it, well, kind of cruel, vindictive even?
That's the debate. The source really pushes on this. Was the prolonged manipulation, the psychological distress he caused, ethically sound?
Especially using Benjamin as a pawn, knowing how much pain that would cause Jacob, demanding they bring him back.
And then the final test, planting the silver cup in Benjamin's sack. That's not just testing, that's a deliberate setup. Entrapment, almost.
It is the anguish he puts Jacob through yet again. It's intense.
So when the reveal finally happens, and Joseph forgives them, the power dynamic is totally skewed. He holds all the cards. Forgiveness is offered, which is good, but does it erase the ethical questions about how he got them to that point?
And his famous line, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good."
A powerful statement of faith and providence. But the ethical question remains. Does God's ability to bring good out of evil somehow justify the evil itself? Does it excuse the brothers' original intent, or even Joseph's manipulative actions?
That's a tough one. It suggests a complex relationship between human actions, divine will, and ultimate outcomes.
And the story ends with the Israelites moving to Egypt, setting the stage for their eventual enslavement generations later, an unintended consequence, perhaps, of Joseph's rise and his family's relocation.
And one last little echo of earlier themes. Jacob, on his deathbed, deliberately crosses his hands to give the primary blessing to Joseph's younger son, Ephraim, over the older Manasseh.
Right. Subverting birth order, maybe a bit of deception or manipulation there too, echoing themes from his own life and the lives of his ancestors.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground. And honestly, it feels like we've only scratched the surface of the ethical maze that is the book of Genesis.
Absolutely. These stories are incredibly rich and dense with moral complexities that people have wrestled with for millennia and continue to wrestle with.
And digging into them like this, it's not just about ancient history. It really does give you insight into how ethical thinking developed and highlights these persistent challenges in making moral choices.
The same kinds of dilemmas: power, responsibility, justice, forgiveness, obedience, deception, they replay themselves constantly.
So maybe a final thought for you listening. Looking at these ancient problems, divine commands that seem harsh, human betrayals, collective punishment, difficult choices, what does it all tell you about justice, about responsibility, about how complex human actions and maybe even divine ones really are, even today?
Yeah, which of these dilemmas from Genesis hits closest to home for you? Which ones make you pause and think about your own moral compass?
Definitely worth reflecting on, and as we said, there's always more to explore. Diving deeper into these stories, looking at different interpretations, there are always more aha moments waiting.
For sure. These texts have endured precisely because they keep raising these vital, difficult questions.